Hi there, my name is Nick, and I have a question for you guys. Now, of those of you who have grown up in the United States, how many of you know the Pledge of Allegiance by heart and could recite it here now if I asked you to? Just by a show of hands, yeah. All right, so it looks like most of you, yeah, cool. The other day I was talking to a friend of mine, and I asked him about it. We were talking about the Pledge of Allegiance, and he said he didn't know the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, this is a friend of mine who grew up in an all-American home and went to school in the American education system, and I was really, really shocked by the fact that he didn't know the Pledge of Allegiance. It really struck me, and my first response was just this disbelief. How can you not know the Pledge of Allegiance? My second response was, why am I so upset that my friend doesn't know the Pledge of Allegiance? And it really got me thinking about the kinds of work that the Pledge of Allegiance is doing. Now, for those of you who know me, you'll know that my time here at Gallatin has been devoted to studying Turkish history, Turkish historiography, Turkish culture, in short, everything Turkey. And so my natural inclination was to sort of think about the Turkish case. Now, interestingly, Turkey also has a Pledge of Allegiance, the Milli Andımız, our national oath, and it was written in 1933, and it's a very interesting, it's a bit of a departure from the way that we understand the Pledge of Allegiance. And I just wanted to show you a clip that sort of destabilizes what exactly I think the work of a Pledge of Allegiance actually is. So he says, good morning. He says, I'm Turkish, I'm honest, I'm hardworking. My principles are to protect those younger than me, to respect my elders, and to love my nation more than myself. So I think this is really interesting. As you watch it, you can see the difference between the way that we perform, the way that we recite the national anthem, and the way that it's done in Turkey. He's standing in front of a crowd, in front of all of his peers, and he, with his high voice, with his sort of, timidness, he's performing the Turkish nation. He's making it come into being. And there's no room here for recalcitrance. There's no space for him to say, whereas, for example, I in high school would stand, but I wouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. There's no space for that here. And now this is performed every morning in Turkish schools, and it's a different person every morning. So I think it's a really interesting foil to our Pledge of Allegiance. I'm here today to talk to you about how language makes the nation come into being. I'm interested in performatives of language and action, and whether acts of speech can generate new ways of being, can make us into national subjects, or as Lisa Wedeen has put it, how persons are established as national through iterative performances of particular national acts. Now, I'd like to bring in the philosopher Louis Althusser here. Althusser says, in a very complex and not entirely clear sentence, that the subject is constitutive of all ideology, but only insofar as all ideology has the concrete function of constituting concrete individuals as subjects in a process that he defines as interpellation. Now, what does this mean? The famous example that's always given is a police officer on a crowded street shouts, "Hey, you there!" And the person who turns around is constituted as the guilty subject because they're turning around by being addressed by an institution of power, in this case, the police officer. So forms of power help actualize him as a subject, as a guilty subject. Is everyone clear? Does it make sense? Totally sort of not doing respect to Althusser, but don't have a lot of time. So what does this have to do with the Pledge of Allegiance? Why should it matter that the Turkish Pledge of Allegiance disturbs us and ours feels sort of everyday? It feels mundane. These are questions that I've been thinking about as I've been working on my senior project here at Gallatin. How does language intersect with nationalism, intersect with violence, and what are the connections among the three? I think Turkey provides a really interesting case study to look at this intersection And in order to sort of make my claim, I'd like to give you guys sort of a hard and fast rundown of Turkish history with several case studies that illustrate my point that language has been a tool in the national ideology of Turkey, a way of systematically eradicating people. So Turkey, the Turkish Republic, was founded in 1923 by this guy here, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. There's still a very large cult of personality around him, and he's sort of the center of Turkish nationalism. Kemalism, as it's called, has several principles, but one of its core principles is nationalism, and it always privileged the Turkish language. There was always this focus on the Turkish language as sort of a sacred thing. This is really interesting to think about in connection to the fact that Turkey has historically been a very culturally diverse place. You know, the Ottoman Empire had all sorts of minorities within it, and once the Turkish Republic was founded, there was this policy of trying to make people speak Turkish, trying to change people from their sort of minority identities and assimilate them into the Turkish nation. So I want to focus on three things that I think are really interesting to think about in this context. First of all, the largest minority in Turkey is the Kurds. Between 15 and 20 million Kurds live in Turkey today. And that's in a country with a population of 74 million, give or take, and you know, that's a really significant percentage of the population. The Kurds in particular have been subject to all sorts of assimilation policies and violence, both symbolic and physical. And I want to sort of share three instances of that with you. So the first instance is the Citizens Speak Turkish campaign. This was a campaign initiated in 1928 by several law students in Istanbul. And it's basically sort of placing the responsibility of sustaining the Turkish nation on the citizen. And so we as citizens have the responsibility to surveil one another and to make sure that we are speaking Turkish. And if somebody's not speaking Turkish, then we need to sort of push them to the periphery. We need to exclude them from participating in the nation as a whole. And one of the ideologues behind this said that in Turkey, to speak a language other than Turkish is to not recognize Turkish law. So it's a really interesting instance where language becomes the focal point, sort of the nexus of nation building. Now, in the 40s and 50s, the discourse evolved, and there was a policy of systematic denial of the existence of Kurds. They would always talk around Kurds, or you know, sort of what I like to describe as not talking about Kurds, where they would use these sort of euphemisms, these circumscribed ways of describing the Kurds. And so the term Mountain Turk was very popular in official discourse, official ideology, to describe them, because Kurds, largely localized to mountainous regions in Turkey, could be described in this way as savage, as apart from civilization, as primitive, and as not willing to participate in the modernizing project. In the 70s and 80s, there emerged this notion of Kurd as this sort of ridiculous or absurd signifier that emerged from, I can never believe it, but it's the sound that their boots made as they walked through the snow, so kartkurt, kartkurt, that they came to understand themselves as Kurdish because they were walking through the snow. And what it does is it completely erases the fact that they have a separate cultural identity. It reduces Kurdish identity to the sounds of their boots, and it erases the fact of their language. And then the last thing that I want to look at or explain to you guys is the state of exception, which was implemented in 1991 and lifted in 2002 in the Kurdish region of Turkey. So a state of exception was systematically placed by the Turkish government. And essentially what that meant was military had entire control of the region. So there were death squads where the Turkish military would go into Kurdish villages, burn down those villages. They would kidnap, kill, torture Kurds, Kurdish men, Kurdish women, and Kurdish children. It was this really, really violent time. It was the peak of what today has been described as the Kurdish question. And it was also accompanied by a systematic denial of the Kurdish language. There was a law that was implemented that said that the mother language of every person in Turkey is Turkish. So you see in this way, there's a linkage between the physical violence, the erasure of people physically, with their erasure discursively. Now, what does this have to do with the Pledge of Allegiance? I think the Pledge of Allegiance is a language that emerges out of this national tradition. It's built upon, it's predicated upon this national tradition. And we call it into being every time we say it. Michael Billig has this term, banal nationalism, that I think really nicely sums it up. That nationalism, as we understand it, resides in the everyday, in the mundane, in the banal, in the ways that we call it into being without even realizing that we're doing so. I think it's important to challenge the idea of the nation as a sustained, solid, singular object of study, and rather, we need to look at it as something that we, through our imaginings and our performances, we make it and remake it, and in turn, it makes and remakes us. And just look at what it makes us do. Thank you.